So as we curated the content for the program today, we recognize that providing a business context for the great work we do is an expectation. And we're going to start with a look at the global economy, and then shift to our industry with some of our friends from AECOM, who will share 10 trends in 10 minutes, and then finally focus on what this means to you and me with a panel of industry leaders really drilling down into the global trends and the industry trends. So please join me in welcoming economist Lauren Seidel-Baker, who's going to provide some big picture context and tell us about the global economic outlook. Lauren.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. How is everyone today? What a great event. Looks like we're doing good. Well, my name is Lauren Seidel-Baker. I'm an economist, so I'm here to fix that. No, so we will keep this pretty high level. As was mentioned, I'm an economist. I'm here to look at the global trends. And it turns out that the global economy, the data that we're able to gather, it's telling a very clear story. So my job today is to tell you that story. I have no agenda, no horse in this race. I just want you to know where we stand right now and what might be coming next. So we'll start with the big picture, the big macroeconomic backdrop. I can think of no larger stance to take than looking at the world as a whole. So I'm going to start with the world, our global output. And we'll drill down sector by sector, country by country, take a little tour around the world, and then look at this industry specifically. So I want to start, as I mentioned, big picture, the entire globe. If we look at the state of the economy globally, we get a very clear and compelling story. So I'm showing you the data two different ways, but it's the same data on this slide. On that left-hand chart, I'm showing you the size. We use world industrial production really as a barometer of how big is our globe right now. So you can see the actual level of activity in our global industrial economy. Those are those bars on the left-hand chart. And you can see our ITR economics forecasts are those individual bars going forward. And this is a good picture. You can see growth. Our economy is getting bigger and bigger. Production is rising. We can see the same trend on this, the right-hand chart on this slide. Now that's our rate of change. So again, the same information, just presented different ways. How quickly or how slowly are we growing? So as you can see, there are a couple of little dips, these little V shapes. Obviously, back in 2008, that was, of course, the Great Recession. And we see that correspond on this chart to that deep V shape where we dip below the zero line. Now that's a contraction, a global recession. The economy actually getting smaller, but only for a short period of time. Because you'll notice that we're well past those pre-recession peaks. Our global economy is so much larger than it was, even in 2006, 2007. We've grown just enormously in the past 10 or so years. And that translates to this rate of change being above the zero line. Sorry, a little laggy on this. But we can look at this a number of different ways. So looking at the global economy as a whole, you can see that rate of change. Sometimes we're going quicker, sometimes going a little slower, but overall, yes, we have been growing since 2009 or so. And that takes us to those forecast points, way off to the right hand of this slide. That shows us that we were growing 4 or 5% or so, always above that zero line, but we've reached the peak. So our world economy, we are still getting bigger. But right now, we're getting bigger at a slightly slower rate of change. So our speed, our pace has just diminished a little bit. I want to be very clear, this is not a recession. We're not below that zero line. Growth will continue, and it will continue globally, but at a slower pace. And our forecasts, in fact, are for the slightly, the slowing pace really to take hold into late 2019, early 2020. And if you look back across that time horizon, this will be amongst the slowest growth we've seen since that Great Recession. So it's not good news, it's not bad news. As long as you know what's coming next, you can be prepared for it. Now I want to delve a little bit deeper into what is this information actually telling us. So on this next slide, I'm showing you where is this GDP across the globe. Obviously, at about 80 trillion US dollars, our world is huge, bigger than it's ever been. Our economy, measured by GDP on this slide, is just massive. Now, the United States makes up about a quarter of that world GDP, of that total output, but China is growing, taking share every time we renew this slide. So currently around 15%, and that share is growing. It is getting bigger. It hasn't passed the US. It probably won't for several years yet. We don't look quite that far out into the future. But we can see China 15%, Japan another 6%. I'll let you follow this across to Brazil, some of the other countries we'll talk about today. But I do want to note, if we were to gather up all of Europe, add those wedges all together, that would be another quarter of world output, roughly the same size as the United States. So if we were just to look at those three geographies, United States, China, and Europe, that's really making up the bulk of world activity right now. So I'll start in the US. I promise we will take that trip around the world in just a little bit. But I want to show you this same slide for US GDP. Where is our domestic economy right now? We see a very similar picture. Obviously, we had a great recession. Our GDP is about $19 trillion. So again, a huge total. Really just hard to even fathom a number that big. But the good news, as you can see on those teal forecasts, is that growth will still persist throughout at least this 3-year outlook and on into the future, into the 2020s. But again, the picture is a little different if we look at that rate of change. So you can see we're growing up around 3%. Now that's that headline figure. If you turn on the news, if you open a newspaper and they say US GDP is up 3.1%, that's what I'm quoting on that right-hand slide. And again, here you can see our forecast. Well, it is for a slightly slowing pace of growth. But right now, we're just at that peak. So the rest of the world has started to slow just ahead of the US. But we're not immune to this trend. We will catch up. And we will get to that slowing growth trend with the rest of the world. Different countries will hit it at different times. The length of rise or decline will last for different amounts of time. But overall, recognize that we are all in the same boat. And in this case, that boat is slowing growth. So now that I've been the buzzkill economist, a little bit of good news is that this is going to be a very mild decline. No recession, technically our very nerdy economic definition for a recession, is 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, which is a mouthful, but it basically means that this rate of change would have to be below 0 for 2 quarters. We don't even have it dipping below 0, really just grazing that 0 line. So there is still growth, but keep in mind again, the slowest pace that we've seen since 2009 or so. Good news is back in 2020, things will be off to the races again, that rising, accelerating growth trend. And if we look at what makes up that $19 trillion bucket, GDP is a $19 trillion figure, I want you to know that it's mostly, well, what you should be interested in, which is the consumer. So in the US at least, about 2/3 of GDP is made up by personal consumption. People like you and me going out buying goods and services, going to Disney, eating at restaurants, staying in hotels. That other third is roughly evenly divided between business investment on the one side and government spending. But we won't touch on those too deeply today. I really want to focus in on your key demographic. That's the consumer. Now, we can look at this data a number of different ways. The way I'm going to primarily show you today is that rate of change. So I want to be very clear. Below 0, whenever we dip those deep V formations, that is a recession or a contraction, the level of activity actually going down. So when we look at a line like this is our barometer for the US economy, the US Industrial Production Index. We can look at a number of other indicators. So there's a lot of data out there in the world, I know because I look at it every day. But some of these data, the data points seem to move ahead of the actual economy. They give us a sense of what might be coming next. So I'm going to add a bunch of lines to this chart. It's going to get a little busy, but overall it's going to give us that story. It's going to tell us what's coming around the corner. So I want to be very clear, this line is the actual level rate of change of US industrial production. And those forecast diamonds, those are our forecast points through year-end 2020. If we look at some global indicators, things that tend to move ahead of our industry, ahead of our economy. For example, the G7 indicator. You might have heard of the group of 7 nations, again, a very globally focused indicator. Well, this has already moved well into recession at this point. Again, it's a leading indicator, so not where things are right now, but where things might be going. You can see historically a great correlation between these two lines, but that this one happens about 12 months into the future. So we have a good 1-year outlook. Again, really supporting our forecast. We can look at a domestic indicator. This is a US Purchasing Managers Index, a little more manufacturing based. But again, we see a similar story. This rate of change has also turned negative. If we look at the stock market, I'm not sure many people want to right now, but we've gotten a little bit of good news lately. But overall, not enough. This Wilshire Total Market Cap, our measure of stock market indicator, again, it's getting to that zero line. And same thing if we add another globally looking leading indicator. In this case, the JP Morgan puts together this number, and it's negative as well. So the signs are out there that we need to be a little bit more cautious. In the United States, we're at the peak of the cycle, the peak growth rates. It feels really good. But this is the time that you need to pause, catch your breath, see what your industry is doing, what these leading indicators are saying, because it, unfortunately, won't be full steam ahead forever. Economies just don't work like that. Now, we have a number of leading indicators. I'll show you some of them as we go through this presentation, but I want to take this back to your key consumer, and that is the consuming public, personal consumption spending. Here I'm showing that with US retail sales. That rate of change is the orange line. So you can see that we've been in this rise, this accelerating growth trend. People are spending more and more and more money just in retail sales. But we're getting again to that peak. So we have a great leading indicator that we calculate every month, and well, it shows that there has been a peak. Things are starting to come back down to earth. We do not expect retail spending to contract, so people will be spending more money. But as I'll talk about in a little bit, things like inflation, well, might make that figure seem a little bit more inflated, the kind of increasing retail sales more than the actual number of goods sold. So this is the backdrop we're facing. In the United States, we're at that peak. It's an inflection point. So it's kind of a scary time because it's hard to know what might come next or when that turn will be. I really want you to have early 2019, the first half of this year, in your minds as that peak inflection point. Sometime in this first half, that's when we'll transition from this accelerating growth, full steam ahead, growing faster and faster and faster, to that slowing growth trend. Again, not a recession, but a slower pace of rise. Now, it always comes back to people, whether it's the visitors to your establishments, whether it's the consumer going out spending money, fueling the economy, 2/3 of GDP, but also the labor side. So I want to start here. Has anyone in this room had any trouble hiring people lately? Maybe you haven't. This is a great industry. I would love to be employed in this industry, so I'm sure they're banging down your doors. But if you were in, well, many other industries, or possibly even some people in this room, it is incredibly hard to find qualified help. The graph I'm showing you here is just the number of jobs in this country. You can see that it is on a rising trend. There's no hill formation forming as we've seen in the past, in the early 2000s in the Great Recession. We are employing more and more and more people in this country. Private sector employment growth, up 1.9% from the year ago. Again, 2% growth on a number this big, that is a huge, huge rate of change. The number of job openings, you'll see, from 1 year ago is up 16.1%. So even though a year ago we were already in this accelerating growth trend, we're up more than 10% just from this time last year. In fact, the number of job openings in the United States is now greater than the number of job seekers. So even if we could perfectly match those skills and just put any body looking for work into a job, we still don't have enough people. I want to also note the quit rate is rising. I've noted that on this slide. That's a measure that people are pretty confident in their ability to find work, because I know I'm not going to quit my job unless I'm pretty sure either I have something else lined up already or I'm fairly confident that I can find something. So a good measure of confidence. The US population, they're very confident in their ability to find work, and this chart says they should be. So things like retention for you will be much more important. Keep your best workers. It's going to be very hard to replace them, probably much more expensive once you find someone, hire them, train them. Keep that in mind. This trend will ease if we get into a slowing growth, but not in the next year or possibly 2 years. There we go. Now we're going to jump ahead, excuse me. Overall, though, the trend will be inflationary. So as we need more workers, well, people are going to compete for them. And that means that wages must rise. So we've seen a period since the Great Recession of slowing wage growth. You can see this is just the percent change in wages from 1 year to the next. For a while, it hovered around the 2% level. That's just a 2%, say, cost of living increase or your annual bump up in pay. Now we're up around 4%. So again, it has been this high in the past if you look back to 2006, but not for 10 or so years. So keep that in mind. This will be inflationary. It will cost more to get the good talent, the skilled workers that you need. But if that's the employer side, well, these same people who are being employed now, who are making more money, they're also our consumers. So they are the ones fueling, again, 2/3 of GDP, going out and consuming these services. So if we look at their disposable income, this is a great message. People are earning more, they're taking home more pay, they have more money to spend. Again, you can see an accelerating growth trend. This is just our rate of change graphed 2 different ways. You can see that that trend is still rising. If we calculate the quarterly rate of change, that's this orange line, against that blue line is the annual rate of change, well, it's a good signal, just the way we work the numbers, that increase will probably persist, at least in the near term. So 2019 looks pretty good for the US consumer. And if we look at who those people actually are, that demographic breakdown, it might surprise you to know that millennials, that dreaded M word, they're now the largest cohort working in the labor force right now. They finally surpassed Gen Xers, they surpassed boomers a while ago. And so the message I want you to take away, and I hate that word millennials too, I only hate it because I am one, but they're not kids anymore. They're in their upper 20s, early 30s. They're finally employed, they have jobs, they're making more money now. They have that income to spend. Now, a lot of it will go down to paying down student debt, but the rest of it will be fueling different growth trends. I want you to keep this chart in mind when we talk about the 10 trends in 10 minutes, because millennials are a very substantial purchasing power in this economy right now. And so some of the preferences of these, no longer kids are fueling change. And we'll talk about a few of those in a little bit. But the other line that might stand out the most on this slide is that red line. So kind of the boomers, 55 to 64. That generation is staying working longer. We see more of them in the labor force than we did 10 or so, or even 20 years ago. And that speaks a lot to the affluence of this group. They're not ready to retire. They're living longer, they're working longer, they're staying healthy longer. And they clearly have the funds to be fueling continued growth in this industry, in any industry. But I promised you a tour of the world, so we will take that global spin. I like to start with this map, again, just looking at industrial production, our benchmark of economic activity in each of these countries. And what I'm showing you here, graphed in red and green, is the rate of change from 1 year ago. So I talked about the US economy. We're up about 4% from this time last year. That's a good pace of growth, but it's going to start to slow. Keep that in mind. Places like Canada and Mexico already starting to see the slowing. So Mexico had a much higher growth rate than we did not too long ago. Now they're down about flat to last year's level. Canada up 2.6%. They tend to be a little steadier, so kind of lower peaks and more mild troughs. But if we take that global spin, you'll notice some of the very darkest green places are really concentrated in Asia. China's the one that stands out to me, just due to sheer size on this scale and that nice dark green color we get, up 5.9%. Now, on a global scale, this is still great growth, but keep in mind, this is nowhere near the double-digit pace of growth that they saw not too long ago. The other standout that I'd like you to note, I think the highest number you'll see on this chart is Vietnam. There's been a massive influx of industry, of manufacturing, of production into Vietnam. So up 9.5%. Again, this is a slower pace. They were up double digits not too long ago. But if you're just looking at where we stand right now, that sheer number, Vietnam is definitely a great growth opportunity. If we look ahead to what's coming next, again, leading indicators don't represent where we are right now. They represent where we're going in 9 months, in 12 months, or a year and a half. So here I have a few European leading indicators. We'll start our tour of the world there. You can see the Eurozone composite PMI, now negative. The EU manufacturing PMI, again, a much more manufacturing kind of industry-specific number, down almost 16%. That really will weigh on growth in Europe. Again, on the manufacturing side, the consumer will be a little more insulated. But the JP Morgan Global Manufacturing PMI, this is that red line on this chart, down 6.3%. This includes things like emerging economies, really a global look at the world. This is really telling us that trend is coming. It might not be a soft landing in all industries, in all countries. We might see some mild contraction. Again, the consumer probably in a better place. We're all earning more. We're all employed. We're all doing well there. And if we look at Europe specifically, I do want to be very clear that slowing growth trend has already hit. So Europe is already growing at a slower pace. It might not feel like that because there is still growth, especially if we look to Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. Those rates are a little bit higher. But I'm going to do the same thing on this chart that I did for US industrial production. Show you that corroborating evidence, what makes us think that this trend will continue. Again, we have that great Europe leading indicator, just a simple sum of different trends we've already seen coming to fruition. And I want to be clear, we're below that zero line, but hopefully, it's too soon to tell conclusively, but hopefully we're at that low point right now. So again, the leading indicator, about a year, year and a half in the future, shows some signs of ticking back up into a recovery trend. Europe economic sentiment, clearly very key for people who are going out spending money on things in this industry. Economic sentiment is still turning down. So take this with a grain of salt because people don't always behave exactly as they say they feel. I'm sure no one in this room has experienced that. But economic sentiment is still negative. It's still below where we were 1 year ago. We can look at the stock market as well. Maybe this is driving that sentiment. If we look at a German stock market indicator, again, it's too soon to tell conclusively if this is that low point, but it might be. We're starting to see some sign of a recovery. And the manufacturing economy as well, still on the downside, still moving lower. So where does that put Europe? Well, as I mentioned, there are still opportunities, still growth in Eastern Europe, but Western Europe is clearly in that slowing growth trend. You can see the very clear rate of change signature, moving to that zero line, possibly even below. We do expect some mild contraction in the European industrial economy. So it won't be severe. You can see much more severe drops on this chart, but there will be some downside signature, at least later this year and into mid-2020. If we continue our tour of the world, hop on a plane and land in South America. We don't have a forecast for this series, but you can see, again, a very similar picture. We're at a nice peak. We're moving down into that slowing growth trend. But our actual level of activity, well, it's still on the rise, higher than it's ever been. So South America, still good opportunity, still some growth. But again, a slower pace, a little bit more measured. And I just want to point out one major economy really driving much of South America, which is Brazil. And here I have just retail trade. So again, getting more to that Brazilian consumer, to the people who would be, the tourists spending money. This is a good indicator for them. And I'm showing you the same information that we saw stacked side by side. Now we just have it stacked top and bottom. So the bottom set of lines is the actual level of activity. This is an index, so it doesn't correlate to dollar terms. But you can see that bottom line, as it's rising, that means retail trade is increasing. People are spending more retail. We can see that in 2014 or so, it started to plateau, to come down just a little bit. Now we're on an uptrend. There was that obvious contraction in 2015 and 2016, driven a lot by commodity prices. But retail trade is on the rebound. Rate of change, however, which is the top two lines, where we are now compared to 1 year ago, well, just about 2.3% higher. So still growing. There is still that upward signature, but again, only 2%. That can easily be overridden by things like inflation. If we look at the Middle East, you'll see, again, additional recessions that some other areas didn't have, driven by, in this case, in 2014, it was the oil price correction. But Middle East production, higher than it's ever been, record levels, still growing, but growing much closer to that zero line than they have been recently. So again, keep in mind, there are still great opportunities, but the economy as a whole is starting to flatten out, starting to get a little bit more measured pace. Finally, turning to Asia. Here I have just the big five in Asia. This is a leading indicator, so keep in mind, not where we are, but where we're going. And we've already seen that bottom point come, so we're back in a recovery trend. It tells us that we will face that downside in Asia, at least in these 5 countries, but that it won't be too long-lived. If we look at Southeast Asia specifically, again, this is just such a wonderful rising trend, almost a straight vertical, just parabolic, if you will. And that corresponds to this rate of change. Look, it's above zero for the vast majority of this series. Still rising, but again, we've hit that topping point, so being a little bit more measured into the future. And China, of course, is the one that blows all of these charts out of the water because we don't even have the zero line graphed on this chart. You can see that we'll get that slowing growth trend, but we'll just turn right back around and back into an accelerating growth trend. Everything is still rising, still growing. Almost, again, almost a linear pace of rise. So keep in mind, China is still slowing, slower growth, but still growing, will still be growing in the future. But if you're looking at China as it was, say, 10 years ago, take a peek at these rates of change. We were up here, double-digit growth, 10% a year, 15% a year. That's just not sustainable anymore. We're looking more at 5%, 6% per year. So it's important to know where that growth will be. It's not linear. It won't ride off into the sunset like a beautiful movie, just 10% this year, 10% last year, 10% next year. That's not how the economy will be. And if we look at the retail side of China, I'll touch on tourism in a minute, but just the retail spending. Here I'm showing you their industrial production rate of change in orange versus retail sales in blue, and you can see there's a very clear correlation. So if the overall Chinese economy is growing at a slower pace, well, retail spending likely will as well. The consumer won't be unaffected. Keep in mind, we don't even have the zero line on this chart. It's at the very bottom, so this will still be growth. But where we do see a zero show up in China is on their building construction. So here I've excluded residential building, just looking at non-residential, and you can see that's actually slightly lower than it was 1 year ago. Now I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to skip a few slides here. But if we look at this industry specifically, we have much more granular data, which we'll get to in the panel and into the 10 trends. But US amusement and recreation construction, I want you to know this industry is a little different than the economy as a whole. It's still in that accelerating growth trend. We can see the rate of change is on the rise, up 7.2% from last year. That's great growth. Theme parks specifically had maybe a slightly flatter year in 2018 and to this point in 2019, but it's in the recovery trend, so things are moving in the right direction for the industry specifically. Now, it's a little different if we look at private galleries and museums. That's really a flat pace. If we just look at the dollar value, $1.6 billion, well, that's hovered at this level more or less really since the recession. So the past 10 years have all hovered here, above zero, below zero, but generally plateauing around this level. But the good news is that people are still spending in this sector. So here I have just personal consumption expenditures for recreation as a whole. So including this industry and including a lot more, sports and things like that. And you can see that people just want to spend their money here. That's great news. If we look at amusement parks, campgrounds, kind of these more focused to your industries, you'll note that the rates of change are actually higher. So people are spending more for amusement as a total, but especially in this industry, they're really targeting their spending here. Again, related recreational services includes a little bit more than the people in this room. Finally, though, before I run out of time, I want to touch on tourism, because that is a key driver for you here. And it's a different picture. Again, keep in mind, we've got that slowing growth trend coming through in the economy, but there is that silver lining. So here I'm showing you US personal consumption expenditures just from foreign visitors to the United States. Now, I chose the United States because it's one of our top 4 countries for the total number of visitors coming in from elsewhere in the globe, and also because it's where we have very clear data. So this shows a trend that as people are traveling, it's true for France, Spain, China, these top 4, as people are traveling, they are spending more money. But in the United States, at least, that level started to plateau. So we can clearly see $170 billion. That is a huge sum total. But it's been this level since 2016 or so. So you might need to be a little bit more targeted, really looking at your specific opportunities, your competitive advantage to get that growth, to grow that share. And I mentioned China is now the 4th largest country for visitors, for inbound visitors. So I'm showing you here select Asian country visitor arrivals. Again, this is a barometer for the region. Unfortunately, we don't have granular enough data for me to include China on this chart. But you can see that there are more and more and more tourists. This rate of change is above zero for almost our entire history. So this is clearly more people are coming to the Asian region. If I was able to include China on this chart, it would be so much higher, because China in 2017 had 139 million inbound tourists, so people coming in from outside the country, entering China. But that number is dwarfed by the 5 billion, with a B, domestic tourists traveling in China from elsewhere in the country. Now, tourism in China is a huge opportunity. I mentioned that China is slowing, yes, but still growing at a slower pace. But keep in mind, just for scale, that last year there was more than $100 billion spent on tourism in China. That is double the level it was just 3 or so years ago. So when that's our pace of growth that we're slowing from, well, there still is good opportunity. The tourism market in China makes up about 10% of their GDP. Now, that's the second highest percentage in the world. And the number of people employed in tourism in China is actually the highest share of total employment of any country. So there are still great growth opportunities here. The number I want to leave you with is that only 7% of Chinese citizens have a passport, and they're already such a global force. So that's our picture. That's our global backdrop. Growth is slowing, but it is still there. So we do have those opportunities, and I look forward to hearing more about them during our 10 Trends in 10 Minutes, and we'll follow up during the panel discussion on global trends. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren. I think Lauren told us a story in numbers this morning, and hopefully you appreciate and took a lot of nuggets out of that. As she indicated, Lauren's going to join our next 2 sessions, and we're going to drill down into this industry and look a little more focused way. In the meantime, we are about to start our first break of the day. Please be back in the room for 10:30. Thank you.